David laid Alaris down on her bed. She told him what she had witnessed, the truth of her people. Her heart bared honestly to him, and the weight of a lifetime of fear and pain raged out of her until she fell asleep in his arms. He pushed some hair out of her face and gently kissed her forehead, then leaned over and kissed her belly. This was his love, and in the most dangerous interaction they have had, they found a way to resolve the problems, his mother's advice bearing fruit again. "Sleep well, my love," he whispered to her before heading to the door. Looking back for a second, a smile curled his lips before he placed his visor back on and opened the door, his gaze falling on a small crowd of Zandradanes, all of whom took a step back as he stepped out. "Do you all need something?" he said calmly. His eyes watching the crowd, it looked like 10 or 9, their shifting making it hard for him to count. However, their silence irritated him more, but he had a good idea as to why they were all here. "Alaris is fine. We had a conversation about our offspring, and no blood was shed. She is resting as the ordeal was difficult for both of us. Now leave and go to your tasks as she wills," he announced in a calm and authoritarian tone. Most broke and headed off until all that was left was Janris and Kiga. Each watching him carefully, Kiga was concerned, while Janris was clearly angry. "Can I help either of you?" David asked slowly. "Step aside, I will see my Judane." Janris growled, a clear challenge to David's authority. David leaned closer, squaring his gaze on her. "My Zandnoi wishes to rest. You may return in an hour, or send her a request to speak." David growled back. They kept their stare down going for a few seconds before Janris roared at him before leaving, irritation clear in her posture and attitude. "I have never seen my aunt like that," Kiga said after Janris was out of earshot, making David relax and turn to face her, brow cocked, to encourage her to ask what she wanted. "Can I see my mother?" "She is resting, but if—" However, he was cut off by the door behind him opening. "Yes, Kiga," Alaris said as David stepped out of the way, giving the two a clear line of sight. "I need to speak with you. It's time you knew something about your sire." Kiga's eyes showed hesitation at the mention of her father, but she nodded and walked past Alaris and into the dimly lit room. Alaris turned her attention to David, her face showing a thankfulness at his effort to give her rest after the turmoil she had placed on him. "I love you, David. Thank you for coming into my life," she said before stretching up and kissing him. "Of course. My Zandno, I love you too," he said as she pulled away and left after the door closed. As David leaned back on his chair, he let a yawn escape as the lack of sleep still haunted his mind even a few days after everything that had happened. It all felt like one long day to him, but that is mostly because of him staying awake for so long. He looked back at the document he typed up and read it over one more time before sending it to the captain and Alaris. The outline of their respective part in his and her wedding was not complex or hard, but he chose to take inspiration from his grandparents' wedding. Not that there was much to pull from. They had gotten marriage after the Fourth World War, but from what there was, he found a line their ordained minister said, a perfect line for him and Alaris. As he stood and took off his jacket, his door rang. Tapping his terminal to check who it was this time, he let a bit of a curse out. Kianris was outside waiting to be let in, and David had forgotten about him over the course of the day, but opened the door anyway, tossing his jacket aside and sitting on the bed. "Hello, sir. May I sit?" Kianris asked hesitantly, his eyes locking on David's face. An overwhelming amount of fear showed as Kianris's ears pinned back. "Hello, Kianris. Yes, sit," David said with a kind smile, and then pointed at his desk. "And hand me my visor." Kianris took slow and careful steps and got to the desk, handing David the visor, and sat slowly down in the chair, watching as David fitted the visor back on. "Sorry about that. I know that you aren't a Hyakish, but your eyes look too much like them," he finally said as David's eyes are covered. "Yeah, I understand," David said after a second and smiled. "What do you want to talk about?" "During the battle, you stayed awake to lead, but you didn't need to. There were others that could have taken over, so why?" Kianris asked slowly. David leaned back. The question was a good one that he could use to teach Kianris a lot, his mind running through the whole ordeal over twice before coming up with an answer that was satisfactory to him. "Well, I guess it's because I understood the enemy. I had a feeling that the people attacking were the ones that tried to exterminate the Zhao Anarm. So I guessed that they would be here to try and remove any trace of them. In order to protect the Zhao Anarm, I had to carefully lead the expedition's efforts to rescue as many as we could. He started before leaning back up and resting his hand on his knees. That way, even if we had lost the ground battle, we could take the survivors to the community and get a task force together to retake their home for them. But I knew of only a few aboard that had led large-scale evacuations, most of which were on the ground, and the last was manning my station, so I had to stay awake until the situation was calm enough for me to rest. David smiled a bit wider at Kianris. Also, I had a great young man making sure I would eat and have something to drink, so thank you for your support. You did a fantastic job. Kianris nodded at the answer, his mind piecing what he said with what he had witnessed. Okay, but why didn't you have your team go full out at the outset? David's smile faded a bit, but he forced it to stay a bit longer. Because of 3 things, and I'll list them in order of importance, David said as he raised his hand and raised one finger. 1. The Republic has laws against using that much force unless absolutely necessary. We don't like war or combat, and we have worked hard to be the diplomats that the Council sees. And we would like to keep it that way. He raised a second finger. 2. I didn't want to cause more damage than needed, and the team's weapons would have caused that kind of damage if I let them out at the start. Too many unknown players on the field. Civilians trying to get to safety, Zhao Anarm forces trying to fight the enemy. Security teams trying to protect their science teams, the enemy forces and their numbers. The battlefield wasn't clear of potential danger, and I wasn't going to swing a massive hammer in a crowd. David raised a third finger. 3. The team didn't have their full combat suits on. They had their exploratory void suits so they wouldn't stand out next to their charges. They were down there to protect it first, not to wage war. But why did you wait until after the siege of the ground base? Kianris asked. Because of the second reason. I wasn't sure where most of everything was, David said back. His mind had the answer ready. Once the siege started, it forced my hand, but I wasn't sure I needed to. We could have waited, and we could have tried to airdrop ammo for the ground teams. But the enemy's AA capabilities were known by that time. I estimated that even if we dropped 20 crates at a time, only 4 would land, and our teams would have run out of ammo. David stretched his neck a bit as he spoke. Also, I needed a rest to clear my head and think about committing to breaking my people's laws. Sometimes you will have to because it is something that must be done, but you have to be sure beforehand. After I slept, I was sure that if I did let my men loose, then we would win, and I also knew that their commander wouldn't surrender. But I had to get the non-humans off that planet, and the only way to keep the evacuation going was to break out. So you knew that this would be the outcome and still chose to do it? Kianris asked, his mind grappling with the admission that David had knowingly done something his mind would never accept. Yeah, that is the essence of being a human, in my opinion, to look carefully at a course of action and see all the consequences of that action and accept them even if you don't want to, David said while gesturing his hand at Kianris. As a thought experiment for you, let us say someone you don't know was being attacked. For this scenario, it's a young, unmarked Xandridane has been attacked by a Xandrafane. He is bigger and stronger than you or her, for sure. Moreover, no one was intervening, not even contacting the authorities. And despite this happening, what would you do and how would your people react? Kianris leaned back into the chair, trapping his tail a bit as he thought about it, his eyes glazing over as his mind raced for choices and outcomes, the scenario playing loops in his mindscape. Well, I did nothing, then she would clearly be hurt or assaulted. She would likely lose any standing in her clan and would eventually most likely choose to go to the Afterlands to escape the shame of having been overpowered like that. Kianris thought aloud, if I did intervene, I wouldn't be able to do much, most likely buy her a few seconds to escape and contact the authorities herself. But I would most likely lose my life in the process. She may be able to keep living, and depending on her actions to follow, she may have the attacker caught and trialed for assault. He leaned forward and focused his eyes, a glint of resolve shining in his mind. But if I did intervene and successfully win, I would either be held as an example of how males should act or hated for unnecessarily intervening. But we would both live. His hands came together into an interlocked grip around each other. I think I would fight for her. Even if I do break some law I am unaware of, I would prioritize her safety over mine because it feels right. It's like some call at my core, to defend her. So, you would rush to her defense because you somehow know you need to, but what if it is a law that you aren't meant to help her without the permission of a Xandridane of your clan? David asked, pointing to a new wall that Keonris had to think over. To go against the word of a Xandridane of his own clan is like betraying your kind for greed and is a capital offense in their society. But Keonris's mind run the scenario over again before answering. I don't think that would change much. I would be willing to sacrifice myself for her, even against the word of a Xandridane. It didn't matter what was happening. If the Xandriphane is actively trying to harm a Xandridane, then I have to at least try to protect her, because it is the right thing to do. David smiled at him. Real humans don't like to sit idle as others suffer, especially when the suffering is caused by humans. David said, his tone reassuring to Keonris. Do you have any more questions? No. You have given me a lot to think about, and I need to rest. Tomorrow is a training day, and Hearth said he wants to rebuild me, whatever that means, Keonris said before he stood and walked to the door. Good luck. And don't worry, Angela will keep you alive. David said back with a smile. Keonris smiled back as he left the room. David stared at the door for a few seconds, before leaning back down on his bed, his arms out to the sides, a day-long sigh of weariness leaving him as a call to sleep lulled his senses. His mind slowly gave into the darkness that crept in, and his will to change out of his clothes along with his strength was gone. His eyes slowly closed as sleep took him. His dreams summon images of him and Alaris sitting on a beach, the cool, salty breeze rushing over them, her form changed by her pregnancy, but she is in his arms resting her head on his shoulder. Before them is the long stretch of soft sand and the Mediterranean Sea beyond. Her fur shifted as she breathed, her hands locked around his. His wish to hold her here on the beach he had spent some of his childhood, it is soothing to him like a call for this reality to be true. A peaceful wish unfolding in his mind. He is snapped awake as a call from the door comes, his mind going to alert instantly, ripping him from his first true dream in longer than he cared to admit. He sat up with a groan and looked to see who was calling him now, and his anger at being awoken faded. He couldn't be mad at her, so he waved his hand before looking at the time. He had slept for about half an hour, but his mind told him he had spent a lifetime with her. Alaris walked in and saw him on the bed rubbing his eyes, his jacket discarded nearby, his visor dropped to the floor beside the bed, his pants and undershirt ruffled in a clear sign of his rest, and boots unbuckled but still on. "Did you need something, Alaris?" He said, his mind still recovering from the shattering of his dream life that he had lived. She walked over to him, a bundle in her arms, her free hand stroking his hair a bit as she got into arm's reach. "No, I wanted to sleep beside you, and the AI told me you were asleep," she said as she placed her bundle on his desk before kneeling down and removing his boots. "But I didn't think you would wake up from the request to enter. I had to send one before using my code to come in." "Oh, right," David said as he slipped one boot off and rose to remove his pants. "Gavi, please authorize Alaris to open my door whenever she needs," David said as he walked over to his dresser and got some sweatpants out before ripping his undershirt off over his head. "Will do. Good night, Alaris and David," the AI said before lowering the light level. As David finished changing to something more comfortable to sleep in, David didn't see much but found a pair of soft furred hands guiding him back to his bed. Trusting her judgment, he laid down and she rested him in her chest, her hand gently stroking his hair, while she hummed a soft and soothing tune, one that felt too claiming on his mind. The scent of hyacinth flowers that lingered in her fur filled his nose. "Alaris, I am sorry I can't give you everything I want to, but I will give you all I have right now," he muttered as his mind slowly fell away to sleep again as his hands relaxed a bit at the back. "I wouldn't ask for anything, my Kuziefane. Now sleep and rest," she said back in a whisper for him. Her words echoed him into a new reality born of his mind, one where they were back on that beach, the one from his childhood, one where now it was them and their child, and she was pregnant again, their child listening intently against her. A beautiful dream of a future he will not see, and the dark willingness to which David had committed his existence, one his core stared at for years. At that moment he blinked, and it felt right.